The inner war. Why the flesh always resists the spirit. Every believer, whether newly awakened or long seasoned in faith, eventually encounters a conflict that cannot be avoided, escaped, or outsourced. This conflict does not originate in the external world, nor is it primarily caused by circumstances, people, or visible opposition. It arises within. Scripture names it plainly: the war between the flesh and the spirit. This inner war is not symbolic, poetic, or philosophical alone. It is existential, daily, and relentless. It shapes decisions, weakens resolve, tests obedience, and determines the direction of a soul's life. The flesh is not merely the body, nor is it limited to physical appetites. Biblically, the flesh represents the fallen nature of humanity, self-oriented, fear-driven, control-seeking, and resistant to surrender. The Spirit, by contrast, represents divine life within the believer, the presence of God that draws the soul upward toward truth, obedience, humility, and eternal alignment. These two forces do not negotiate. They do not coexist peacefully. They oppose one another fundamentally because they desire opposite ends. This is why the Christian life often feels paradoxical. One may love God sincerely and yet feel pulled toward what undermines that love. One may desire righteousness and yet struggle against impulses that contradict it. This tension does not mean faith is weak. It means faith is alive. Where there is no war, there is no resistance. And where there is no resistance, there is often no transformation. Understanding this inner war is not optional for spiritual maturity. Those who fail to recognize it often misinterpret their struggles as personal failure, divine abandonment, or hypocrisy. In reality, what they are experiencing is the normal friction between an old nature that wants control and a new life that requires surrender. The flesh resists the spirit because the spirit threatens its authority. The Spirit exposes what the flesh hides. The Spirit leads where the flesh cannot survive. This series exists to illuminate that battle, not to glorify struggle, but to bring clarity, vigilance, and hope. The goal is not merely to identify the flesh, but to understand its strategies, its fears, and its predictable patterns of resistance. Only then can the believer learn how to walk by the Spirit, rather than be ruled by what is passing away. What follows is not theory, it is truth tested in lived faith, and it begins where the war truly starts. The origin of the conflict. Two natures, one life. The inner war between flesh and spirit begins the moment a person is spiritually awakened. Before that awakening, there is no real conflict, only instinct, desire, habit, and survival. The flesh rules unchallenged because there is no competing authority within. But when the Spirit enters, everything changes. A new life is introduced into a space long governed by self. This is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental disruption. Scripture makes this clear when it states that the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit desires what is contrary to the flesh. This language is not metaphorical. It describes two opposing wills operating within the same person. The believer does not replace one nature with another instantly. Instead, they carry both, and the tension between them defines the journey of sanctification. The flesh resists the Spirit because the Spirit represents loss of control. The flesh thrives on autonomy, self-preservation, and immediate gratification. It seeks comfort, recognition, security, and dominance. The Spirit, on the other hand, calls for trust, obedience, patience, humility, and dependence on God. Where the flesh says, protect yourself, the Spirit says, deny yourself. Where the flesh says, take, the Spirit says, give. Where the flesh says, avoid pain, the Spirit says, carry your cross. This resistance is not accidental, it is structural. The flesh cannot submit to the spirit without ceasing to be the flesh. Submission would mean death to its authority. That is why it resists so fiercely, often disguising itself as logic, prudence, self-care, or even religious duty. The flesh rarely announces itself as rebellion. More often, it presents itself as reason. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this conflict is that the flesh does not always push toward obvious sin. In fact, its most effective strategy is subtlety. It prefers partial obedience over open rebellion, delay over refusal, and spiritual activity over spiritual surrender. It is comfortable with religion as long as that religion does not demand transformation. The flesh will pray if prayer does not lead to obedience. It will read Scripture if Scripture does not challenge identity. It will serve if service does not require humility. The Spirit, however, is not interested in appearances. The Spirit works inwardly, targeting motives, intentions, and loyalties. This is why walking by the Spirit often feels uncomfortable. The Spirit brings conviction, not condemnation, but conviction still disrupts comfort. It reveals attachments that must be released and habits that must be surrendered. It exposes fears that have been masquerading as wisdom. The inner war intensifies as spiritual awareness grows. The more clearly a believer hears the Spirit's leading, the more strongly the flesh reacts. This is why moments of breakthrough are often followed by resistance. When clarity increases, so does opposition. The flesh senses that its territory is shrinking and it fights to retain ground. Many believers make the mistake of assuming that spiritual growth should make life easier. In some ways it does, but in others, it makes the battle more visible. What once went unnoticed now demands attention. What once felt natural now feels misaligned. This is not regression, it is refinement. The Spirit is sharpening discernment, and discernment reveals conflict. The tragedy is not that the war exists. The tragedy is when believers are unaware of it. When the conflict is misunderstood, people turn inward with shame instead of upward with dependence. They attempt to discipline the flesh with willpower instead of surrendering to the Spirit with trust. They fight spiritual battles using natural strength, which only empowers the very nature they are trying to overcome. Victory in this war does not come through suppression alone. It comes through alignment. The flesh grows weaker, not because it is attacked directly, but because it is starved of authority. When the Spirit leads consistently, the flesh loses influence. This is why Scripture does not say to fight the flesh, but to walk by the Spirit. Movement matters, direction matters, leadership matters. The origin of the conflict teaches us something crucial. The presence of struggle is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of life. Dead things do not resist. Only living things do. If the flesh is resisting the Spirit within you, it is because the Spirit is truly there, and that presence, though contested, is the greatest assurance of all. Before moving forward in this series, this truth must be settled. The war within you is not a curse, it is a calling. It is the battleground where obedience is forged, character is refined, and faith becomes more than belief. It becomes practice. If this teaching is helping you understand your inner battle more clearly, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These messages are released to strengthen those walking this path, and subscribing ensures you don't miss the next part of this journey. The strategies of the flesh. How resistance manifests daily. The resistance of the flesh against the Spirit is not chaotic or random. It is structured, adaptive, and deeply familiar with the human psyche. The flesh has existed within humanity since the fall, and over time it has perfected its methods. It does not rely primarily on force, but on persuasion. It does not usually confront the Spirit head-on. Instead, it works through distraction, distortion, delay, and emotional manipulation. Understanding these strategies is essential because what is not recognized cannot be resisted. and what is misunderstood often gains power by default. One of the flesh's primary strategies is urgency without wisdom. The flesh pushes the believer to act quickly, emotionally, and reactively. It thrives on impatience. The Spirit, by contrast, often calls for stillness, waiting, and discernment. When the flesh senses that waiting might lead to obedience, it creates pressure. It generates anxiety that demands immediate relief. This is why many decisions that later bring regret were made under emotional intensity rather than spiritual clarity. The flesh frames urgency as necessity, convincing the believer that if something is not done now, an opportunity will be lost or a threat will become unbearable. In reality, this urgency is often a distraction designed to bypass discernment. Another strategy of the flesh is justification. The flesh is skilled at creating narratives that make disobedience seem reasonable. It rarely argues against God openly. Instead, it reframes situations so that compromise feels logical. It emphasizes circumstances, past wounds, personality traits, or perceived injustices as excuses for behavior that contradicts spiritual conviction. The flesh says, "Given what you've been through, this reaction is understandable," or, in this case, obedience would be unrealistic. These justifications feel compassionate, but they subtly replace trust in God with trust in self-assessment. The flesh also resists the Spirit through selective obedience. This is one of its most deceptive tactics. Selective obedience allows the believer to feel faithful while avoiding transformation. The flesh agrees to what aligns with comfort and resists what requires surrender. It will gladly obey in visible, socially rewarded areas while quietly rejecting obedience in private, costly ones. This creates an illusion of spiritual health. Outwardly, life appears aligned. Inwardly, key areas remain untouched. Over time, this selective obedience hardens into spiritual stagnation because growth only occurs where surrender is complete. Fear is another powerful tool of the flesh. The flesh is deeply invested in self-preservation. It fears loss of control, loss of identity, loss of relationships, and loss of security. When the Spirit leads toward change, the flesh responds by projecting worst-case scenarios. It imagines rejection, failure, loneliness, and instability. These fears feel real because they are emotionally vivid, but they are often exaggerated or unfounded. The flesh magnifies uncertainty until obedience feels dangerous. The Spirit, however, calls for trust precisely where outcomes are unseen. Faith is not certainty of results. It is confidence in God's character. The flesh resists this by demanding guarantees before obedience. Another subtle strategy is distraction through busyness. The flesh does not always oppose spiritual activity. It often overloads it. A believer can be busy with religious tasks and still avoid intimacy with God. The flesh fills schedules with noise, obligations, and constant engagement so that silence becomes rare. Silence is dangerous to the flesh because it creates space for conviction. In stillness, the Spirit speaks clearly. In busyness, that voice is drowned out. The flesh prefers exhaustion over reflection because a tired soul is less discerning and more reactive. The flesh also uses comparison as a form of resistance. It constantly measures spiritual life against others rather than against truth. This leads either to pride or to discouragement, both of which hinder growth. When comparison produces pride, the believer becomes complacent, assuming they are doing well enough. When it produces discouragement, the believer becomes paralyzed, believing they can never measure up. In both cases, focus shifts away from obedience towards self-evaluation. The Spirit leads personally, uniquely, and relationally. The flesh prefers metrics, rankings, and external validation. Another deeply ingrained tactic of the flesh is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning treats feelings as authoritative truth. If something feels right, it must be right. If something feels wrong, it must be wrong. The flesh elevates emotion above conviction. While emotions are real and meaningful, they are not reliable guides for spiritual direction. The Spirit often leads in ways that feel uncomfortable, especially when growth requires confrontation, humility, or sacrifice. Emotional resistance is not proof of misdirection. Often, it is evidence of transformation in progress. The flesh also resists through procrastination disguised as prudence. It convinces the believer that now is not the right time to obey. It promises future faithfulness once conditions improve. This delay feels responsible, but it often results in disobedience by default. The Spirit speaks in the present tense. Obedience delayed is often obedience denied. Over time, habitual delay dulls sensitivity to conviction. The voice of the Spirit becomes quieter, not because God withdraws, but because attention has shifted. One of the most dangerous strategies of the flesh is redefining identity. The flesh ties identity to past mistakes, current struggles, or external labels. It says, "This is just who you are." This framing limits transformation by making growth feel unnatural or unrealistic. The Spirit, however, speaks identity based on divine calling, not current condition. It calls things that are not as though they were. When the flesh controls identity, obedience feels like self-betrayal. When the Spirit defines identity, obedience feels like alignment. The flesh also resists the Spirit through isolation. It convinces the believer that struggles must be faced alone, that vulnerability is weakness, and that seeking help is failure. Isolation amplifies temptation and distorts perception. The Spirit works relationally, often through community, accountability, and shared wisdom. Isolation protects the flesh by removing external mirrors that reveal truth. Alone, the believer is more likely to rationalize compromise. Another method of resistance is minimizing sin. The flesh downplays the significance of small compromises. It frames them as harmless, temporary, or inconsequential, but spiritual erosion rarely happens through dramatic collapse. It happens through gradual accommodation. The Spirit convicts early, before patterns form. The flesh resists this early intervention by insisting that nothing serious is happening. Over time, what was once unthinkable becomes normal. The flesh is also reactive to authority. Any call to submission triggers resistance. This includes submission to God, to Scripture, and even to wise counsel. The flesh associates submission with loss of dignity or autonomy. It prefers independence, even when independence leads to confusion. The Spirit, by contrast, understands that submission is not loss, but alignment. True freedom is not autonomy from God, but harmony with Him. The flesh resists this truth because it challenges the illusion of self-sufficiency. Importantly, the flesh adapts. When one strategy fails, another emerges. If temptation is resisted, discouragement follows. If discouragement is overcome, distraction appears. If distraction is rejected, pride or fear may surface. This adaptability is why spiritual vigilance must be continuous. The inner war does not end with a single victory. It requires daily awareness, humility, and dependence. However, recognizing these strategies is not meant to produce paranoia or self-condemnation. It is meant to produce clarity. The flesh loses power when its patterns are exposed. Light does not need to argue with darkness. It simply reveals it. Awareness creates space for choice. Choice creates opportunity for obedience. Obedience strengthens alignment with the Spirit. The most important truth to remember is this: the flesh resists because it is losing. Resistance is not a sign of dominance. It is a sign of threat. The Spirit would not be opposed if it were not effective. Every moment of conviction, every internal tension toward obedience, every discomfort that draws you toward truth is evidence that the Spirit is active. This war is not meant to be fought alone or in human strength. The flesh thrives when the believer relies on willpower alone. The Spirit leads when the believer relies on grace, truth, and surrender. Victory is not found in perfection, but in persistence. Each choice to follow the Spirit weakens the flesh's grip, even if the progress feels slow. If this teaching is strengthening your understanding of the daily strategies used by the flesh, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These messages are created to equip you for this inner journey, and subscribing ensures you continue walking forward with clarity and strength. Why the flesh fears: obedience, control, identity, and the threat of surrender. The flesh does not fear morality. It does not fear religious language, spiritual vocabulary, or even disciplined behavior. What the flesh truly fears is obedience. Obedience, in its deepest sense, represents surrender of control, and control is the core currency of the flesh. Everything the flesh does, every argument it constructs, every emotion it amplifies, every fear it projects, serves one central goal: to remain in charge of direction, timing, and outcome. The Spirit threatens this control not by force, but by invitation, and that invitation terrifies the flesh. Obedience to the Spirit requires trust in something unseen. The flesh depends on what it can measure, predict, and manage. It prefers certainty, even if that certainty is limiting or destructive, over faith, which requires stepping into the unknown. This is why the flesh often chooses familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. Familiar pain can be managed. Unfamiliar peace requires relinquishing patterns that once provided a sense of safety. The Spirit calls the believer beyond what is known, and the flesh resists because the unknown represents vulnerability. At the heart of this resistance is identity. The flesh has built an identity over time, an internal narrative shaped by experiences, wounds, achievements, failures, and survival strategies. This identity feels personal and deeply ingrained. When the Spirit calls for obedience, it often challenges not just behavior, but self-concept. The Spirit may lead someone away from roles, relationships, habits, or ambitions that once defined them. To the flesh, this feels like annihilation. It equates obedience with self-erasure, not realizing that what is being dismantled is not the true self, but a false one constructed for survival rather than alignment. This is why obedience often triggers an internal crisis. The flesh interprets surrender as loss of autonomy, loss of control, loss of status, loss of predictability. The Spirit, however, understands obedience as realignment. It is not the destruction of self, but the restoration of it. Yet restoration requires letting go of what was never meant to last. The flesh cannot accept this easily because it has invested heavily in maintaining the illusion that it knows what is best. Another reason the flesh fears obedience is exposure. Obedience brings hidden things into the light. It reveals motives that were once masked by good intentions. It uncovers attachments that were justified as necessities. It exposes fears that were disguised as wisdom. The flesh thrives in ambiguity, where intentions can remain unclear and accountability can be avoided. Obedience clarifies. It draws lines. It demands decision. This clarity leaves little room for rationalization. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience creates momentum. One act of surrender often leads to another. Once the believer experiences the freedom that comes from aligning with the Spirit, the flesh's authority weakens, patterns begin to shift, desires change. What once felt irresistible loses its grip. This cascading effect threatens the entire system the flesh has built to maintain dominance. Obedience is rarely isolated, it multiplies. Control is not only about actions, it is also about outcomes. The flesh wants to obey only when results can be guaranteed. It asks, "What will happen if I obey?" The Spirit asks, "Who are you trusting if you do?" And this difference reveals the flesh's deepest insecurity. It does not trust God's character fully. It wants proof before surrender. Faith, however, operates in the opposite direction. It surrenders first and understands later. This reversal feels reckless to the flesh, even though it is foundational to spiritual life. The flesh also resists obedience because obedience disrupts comfort. Comfort is not inherently wrong, but when comfort becomes a guiding principle, it replaces obedience as the ultimate value. The flesh elevates ease, convenience, and emotional safety above alignment with truth. The Spirit may lead into difficult conversations, uncomfortable changes, or seasons of waiting that stretch patience and endurance. The flesh interprets discomfort as danger. The Spirit sees it as growth. Another layer of resistance lies in the flesh's attachment to self-righteousness. The flesh prefers to feel good about itself rather than be transformed. Obedience often reveals areas of pride, insecurity, or self-deception that threaten the image the flesh has curated. It is easier to perform righteousness than to submit to it. The flesh resists obedience because obedience humbles. It places the believer in a posture of dependence rather than competence. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience requires listening. Truly listening to the Spirit means slowing down, becoming still, and paying attention to subtle conviction. The flesh prefers noise. Noise keeps reflection at bay. Noise distracts from inner tension. Obedience requires silence, and silence creates space for truth. In that space, excuses dissolve. The flesh resists silence because silence removes its cover. One of the most profound reasons the flesh fears obedience is that obedience shifts authority. Authority determines who defines reality. When the flesh holds authority, reality is defined by emotion, logic, preference, and fear. When the Spirit holds authority, reality is defined by truth, purpose, and divine perspective. This shift feels destabilizing to the flesh because it can no longer interpret events solely through self-interest. Obedience aligns interpretation with God rather than self. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience produces fruit that cannot be controlled. Love, patience, self-control, humility, and peace are not tools the flesh can manipulate. These qualities flow from surrender, not effort. Once they begin to grow, the believer becomes less reactive, less defensive, and less driven by ego. This transformation reduces the flesh's leverage. A person who is no longer easily provoked or driven by fear is harder to manipulate internally. It is important to understand that the flesh does not fear punishment as much as it fears irrelevance. It fears becoming unnecessary. The Spirit does not coexist with the flesh as an equal partner. One leads, the other follows. Obedience determines which one holds influence. This is why the flesh reacts so strongly at moments of decision. It senses a shift in leadership. Many believers misunderstand obedience as rigid compliance rather than relational trust. This misunderstanding strengthens the flesh's resistance. When obedience is framed as loss of freedom, the flesh rebels. When obedience is understood as alignment with truth, peace, and purpose, resistance weakens. The Spirit does not demand obedience to dominate, it invites obedience to heal. The flesh cannot accept this because it equates authority with control, not care. Obedience also dismantles the illusion of self-sufficiency. The flesh prides itself on independence. It wants to believe it can manage life on its own terms. Obedience acknowledges dependence, not weakness but relational trust. It says, I do not see everything clearly, but I trust the one who does. This humility is foreign to the flesh. The flesh prefers mastery over mystery. Over time, consistent obedience reshapes desire. What once felt restrictive begins to feel liberating. What once felt fearful begins to feel peaceful. This shift is deeply threatening to the flesh because it undermines its narrative that surrender leads to loss. Experience contradicts fear. Each act of obedience becomes evidence that the Spirit leads toward life, not deprivation. This does not mean obedience eliminates struggle. The war continues, but the balance shifts. The flesh still resists, but its arguments lose credibility. The believer begins to recognize patterns more quickly. Conviction becomes clearer. Recovery from misalignment becomes faster. Obedience trains spiritual sensitivity. Ultimately, the flesh fears obedience because obedience points toward death. Not physical death, but the death of false authority. It is the end of the flesh's rule, not the end of the self. The Spirit does not destroy identity. It restores it to its intended design. The flesh cannot see this future, so it clings to the present. Understanding this fear changes how the believer responds to resistance. Instead of interpreting inattention as failure, it can be seen as confirmation that obedience matters. The louder the resistance, the more significant the step. The flesh does not fight what does not threaten it. If this teaching is helping you understand why obedience feels so costly yet so necessary, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These messages are created to guide you through this inner journey with clarity, depth, and truth. Subscribing ensures you continue receiving teachings that strengthen your walk by the Spirit. How the flesh masquerades as wisdom, discernment, deception, and the subtle war for the mind. One of the most dangerous aspects of the inner war is not blatant temptation, emotional outbursts, or visible moral failure. Those are easier to recognize and, therefore, easier to confront. The most dangerous resistance of the flesh is subtle. It is quiet, convincing, and often indistinguishable from wisdom. The flesh rarely presents itself as rebellion. Instead, it disguises itself as discernment, caution, realism, and even spiritual maturity. This disguise allows it to remain in control while appearing reasonable, responsible, and faithful. The flesh understands that open defiance of the Spirit alarms the conscience. Subtle distortion, however, bypasses it. When the flesh masquerades as wisdom, it does not say, disobey God. It says, be careful. And it does not say, ignore conviction. It says, don't be extreme. It does not say, choose comfort over truth. It says, God understands your limits. These statements sound compassionate and balanced, but when examined closely, they often redirect authority away from the Spirit and back to self-judgment. True discernment flows from alignment with truth, not from fear of consequences. The flesh-based version of discernment is rooted in self-protection. It evaluates every spiritual prompting through the lens of risk, comfort, and personal cost. When the Spirit invites obedience, the flesh immediately calculates potential loss. It asks what will be sacrificed, who might be displeased, and what stability might be disrupted. This calculation feels intelligent, but it subtly redefines wisdom as outcome management rather than faithfulness. The flesh often equates wisdom with emotional safety. If something feels destabilizing, it must be unwise. If something creates inattention, it must be avoided. But spiritual growth almost always involves tension because it stretches identity, exposes attachments, and challenges assumptions. The Spirit frequently leads through discomfort, not because discomfort is the goal, but because transformation requires movement beyond familiar boundaries. The flesh cannot accept this, so it labels discomfort as a warning sign rather than a growth signal. Another way the flesh masquerades as wisdom is by appealing to timing. It claims that obedience is not wrong, just premature. It insists that waiting is the mature choice, even when conviction is clear. This delay feels prudent, but it often masks fear. The flesh prefers indefinite postponement over decisive surrender. Over time, repeated delay dulls sensitivity. What once felt urgent becomes optional. What once felt clear becomes negotiable. The flesh preserves control by stretching obedience into an undefined future. The flesh also hides behind complexity. It complicates what the Spirit makes simple. When the Spirit convicts, the message is often clear and direct. The flesh responds by introducing layers of analysis, questions, and hypothetical scenarios. It turns obedience into a puzzle rather than a response. This intellectualization creates distance between conviction and action. The believer feels productive by thinking deeply, but nothing actually changes. Complexity becomes a refuge from obedience. Another common disguise is spiritual comparison. The flesh evaluates spiritual prompts by measuring them against what others are doing. If obedience would set the believer apart, it feels risky. The flesh prefers conformity over faithfulness. It asks, is this reasonable? Is this normal? Do others do this? The Spirit, however, leads uniquely. Calling is personal. Obedience is not democratic. When comparison becomes the standard, obedience becomes conditional. The flesh also uses past experience as a false compass. It argues that previous outcomes predict future results. If obedience once led to disappointment, the flesh uses that memory to resist future obedience. It says, "You tried that before, look what happened." This reasoning ignores the dynamic nature of growth and the fact that obedience is not transactional. The Spirit does not promise predictable outcomes. It promises faithful presence. The flesh reduces faith to a cause and effect system and then rejects it when results do not align with expectations. One of the most convincing disguises the flesh wears is humility. False humility avoids obedience under the guise of inadequacy. It says, "I'm not ready," or "I'm not qualified," or "I'm not strong enough." While these statements may contain truth, they often serve as excuses for inaction. The Spirit does not call based on readiness, but on willingness. Genuine humility says, "I cannot do this without God." False humility says, "Because I cannot do this, I will not try." The flesh prefers the latter because it avoids dependence. The flesh also reframes control as responsibility. It insists on managing outcomes to prevent harm. It claims that surrender would be irresponsible, risky, or naive. But this sense of responsibility is often rooted in mistrust, either of God's guidance or of God's timing. True responsibility aligns with obedience, trusting that God accounts for consequences beyond human perception. The flesh assumes that if control is released, chaos will follow. The Spirit reveals that control itself often creates the chaos we fear. Another subtle tactic is redefining peace. The flesh defines peace as absence of disturbance. If obedience disrupts emotional equilibrium, it must be wrong. The Spirit defines peace as alignment with truth, even when circumstances are challenging. This difference is critical. The flesh seeks calm without change. The Spirit offers peace through transformation. When peace is misdefined, the believer avoids necessary growth to maintain emotional comfort. The flesh also appeals to compassion, especially when obedience might cause conflict. It frames avoidance as kindness. It says, "You don't want to hurt anyone," or "Love means keeping the peace." While love is central to spiritual life, the flesh twists it into conflict avoidance. The Spirit understands that truth spoken in love may still cause discomfort, but that discomfort can lead to healing. The flesh avoids short-term pain at the cost of long-term growth. One of the most overlooked ways the flesh masquerades as wisdom is through spiritual exhaustion. It convinces the believer that rest means disengagement from obedience. While rest is essential, the flesh uses fatigue as justification to ignore conviction. It frames obedience as an additional burden rather than a source of renewal. The Spirit offers rest through alignment, not avoidance. Obedience often restores clarity and energy, even when it initially feels demanding. The flesh also manipulates discernment by isolating it from Scripture. It elevates personal interpretation above revealed truth. It says, "This is how I feel God is leading me," even when that direction contradicts foundational principles. This individualized spirituality feels authentic, but without anchoring, it becomes subjective and unstable. The Spirit does not contradict himself. When discernment drifts from truth, the flesh gains influence under the appearance of spiritual independence. Over time, these disguises create confusion. The believer struggles to distinguish between genuine spiritual caution and flesh-based avoidance. This confusion weakens confidence. When confidence erodes, obedience becomes hesitant. The flesh thrives in hesitation. Decisiveness is dangerous to it because decisiveness requires commitment. Clarity returns when the believer learns to recognize patterns rather than isolated thoughts. The flesh repeats familiar arguments. It uses the same fears, the same delays, the same justifications. The Spirit, by contrast, is consistent in character but fresh in expression. It leads toward truth, freedom, and alignment. Even when the path is uncomfortable, the solution to flesh-disguised wisdom is not suspicion of all inner reasoning, but alignment with truth and surrender. Discernment sharpens when the believer prioritizes obedience over outcome, faith over control, and truth over comfort. The flesh loses credibility when its predictions repeatedly fail, and the Spirit's leading repeatedly proves trustworthy. The inner war intensifies at the level of the mind, because the mind is where direction is chosen. Whoever defines wisdom defines the path. The flesh fights hardest here because losing mental authority means losing leadership entirely. When the Spirit governs the mind, obedience becomes clearer, resistance becomes recognizable, and freedom becomes tangible. If this teaching is helping you see how subtle and convincing the flesh can be when it disguises itself as wisdom, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These messages exist to sharpen discernment, strengthen obedience, and help you walk in alignment with the Spirit. Subscribing ensures you continue this journey with clarity and depth, walking by the Spirit. How alignment weakens the flesh and transforms the inner war. The final truth about the inner war is this: the flesh is not defeated primarily by confrontation, suppression, or self-discipline alone. It is weakened by displacement. The flesh loses power when it is no longer in the position of leadership. The Spirit does not negotiate with the flesh, nor does he attempt to reform it. He replaces its authority. This is why Scripture does not command believers to obsess over the flesh, but to walk by the Spirit. Walking implies movement, direction, and consistency. It is not a momentary decision, but a daily orientation. Many believers misunderstand victory as the absence of struggle. They assume that spiritual maturity should eliminate inner conflict. In reality, maturity changes the nature of the conflict. The battle does not disappear, but it becomes clearer. The believer learns to recognize which voice is speaking, which impulse is leading, and which direction produces life. Over time, the flesh becomes less persuasive, not because it stops speaking, but because its patterns are exposed and its promises are proven empty. Walking by the Spirit begins with attention. What you consistently attend to shapes what you are led by. The flesh thrives on automatic reactions. The Spirit invites intentional awareness. When a believer slows down enough to notice inner movements, thoughts, urges, emotional surges, they create space for discernment. This space interrupts the flesh's momentum. The Spirit often speaks softly, not because he is weak, but because truth does not need to shout. Attention tunes the heart to that voice. Alignment with the Spirit also requires trust. Trust is not passive acceptance, it is active reliance. To walk by the Spirit means to act on conviction even when certainty is absent. The flesh demands proof before obedience. The Spirit asks for obedience before proof. This reversal feels risky, but it is foundational. Each step taken in trust strengthens confidence, not because outcomes are always easy, but because God's faithfulness becomes experiential rather than theoretical. Another key element of walking by the Spirit is surrender of outcomes. The flesh is deeply invested in results. It measures success by visible gains, comfort, and approval. The Spirit measures alignment by faithfulness. When the believer releases the need to control results, obedience becomes lighter. Anxiety decreases because responsibility shifts. The believer is no longer carrying the weight of determining how things must turn out. That weight was never meant to be carried by human strength. Walking by the Spirit also involves retraining desire. The flesh trains desire toward immediacy. It wants relief now, pleasure now, resolution now. The Spirit reshapes desire toward depth, meaning, and long-term fruit. This reshaping does not happen instantly. It happens through repeated alignment. Each time the believer chooses the Spirit's leading over immediate gratification, desire is subtly redirected. Over time, what once felt difficult begins to feel natural. The Spirit weakens the flesh by starving it of reinforcement. The flesh grows stronger when its impulses are obeyed. It grows weaker when they are acknowledged but not acted upon. This is not repression, it is redirection. The believer does not pretend the urge does not exist. They simply choose not to follow it. This choice, repeated consistently, retrains the inner hierarchy. Leadership shifts. Community also plays a vital role in walking by the Spirit. Isolation amplifies the flesh's voice. Shared truth reduces its influence. When believers walk alongside others who value obedience, discernment sharpens and accountability strengthens resolve. The Spirit often confirms direction through wise counsel and shared insight. This does not replace personal conviction, but it supports it. The flesh prefers secrecy. The Spirit works in light. Walking by the Spirit requires patience with the process. Transformation is gradual. The flesh often uses imperfection as an excuse to quit. It frames failure as evidence that change is impossible. The Spirit frames failure as feedback. Each misstep reveals an area that needs deeper surrender. Growth is not linear, but it is directional. As long as the believer continues walking, progress is being made, even when the pace feels slow. Another crucial aspect is renewing the mind. The flesh relies on old narratives, stories about who you are, what you deserve, and what is possible. The Spirit introduces new narratives rooted in truth. Renewal happens through consistent exposure to that truth. As the mind is renewed, reactions change. Temptations lose intensity. Fear loses authority. Peace becomes more accessible, not because circumstances improve, but because perception changes. Walking by the Spirit also involves learning to respond rather than react. The flesh reacts impulsively. The Spirit responds intentionally. Reaction is driven by emotion. Response is guided by conviction. This difference transforms relationships, decisions, and internal stability. When the believer learns to pause before acting, the Spirit has room to lead. That pause becomes a powerful act of alignment. Importantly, walking by the Spirit does not mean perfection. It means direction. The flesh thrives on shame, using it to discourage perseverance. The Spirit convicts without condemning. Conviction invites return. Condemnation pushes away. When the believer stumbles, the Spirit calls them back into alignment rather than driving them into despair. This grace sustains the journey. Over time, the inner war shifts from chaos to clarity. The believer no longer feels torn between indistinct forces. They recognize patterns, they understand resistance, they trust conviction. Peace increases, not because life becomes easy, but because alignment becomes familiar. The flesh loses its urgency, its threats sound hollow, its promises feel unconvincing. The ultimate transformation occurs when obedience becomes relational rather than transactional. The believer no longer obeys to avoid punishment or earn approval. They obey because alignment brings life. The Spirit is no longer perceived as a challenger to freedom, but as its source. The flesh cannot compete with this kind of motivation. Control loses appeal when trust proves fulfilling. The inner war does not end in this life, but its intensity diminishes as alignment deepens. The believer learns that victory is not about silencing the flesh, but about listening to the Spirit. Where attention goes, authority follows. Where authority follows, direction is set. Walking by the Spirit is not a mystical concept reserved for the spiritually elite. It is a daily practice available to every believer. It begins with one choice repeated consistently: to trust God more than impulse, truth more than fear, and obedience more than comfort. Each step weakens the flesh's grip and strengthens the Spirit's influence. If this final teaching has helped you understand how alignment with the Spirit transforms the inner war and leads to lasting freedom, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These messages are created to walk with you through this journey of faith, discernment, and transformation. Subscribing ensures you continue receiving teachings that strengthen your walk and deepen your alignment with the Spirit.